So rogues are the most agile of the three main classes in Dragon Age the Veilguard. Making use of both dual-wielding weapons and bows, there are many ways to build this class up. For long or close range, high bursts of damage, spreading afflictions such as necrotic damage, and even providing a tactical control over the battlefield via traps and auto turrets. So today we're going over a complete breakdown of its unique abilities, specializations, to see if this is truly the best class for you. Now, the class has changed quite a bit from Dragon Age Inquisition. On one side, they are much more mobile than ever, quickly dashing between enemies with ease, performing dodges and parries, which are part now of their default moveset. Their weapons of choice include a dual-wield main and offhand weapon, as well as a bow which you can freely alternate to via right-click in combat. Performing light attacks with either of these will generate momentum, your class resource, which you get to spend to cast your abilities. But unlike other classes, rogues don't feature a secondary weapon set. Instead, the class freely switches between the melee and the ranged options, as well as featuring a much more extensive list of combos, most of which you get to additionally unlock from the skill tree. So skills such as the old Shadow Step, Spinning Blades, Twin Fangs, or even the parry no longer need to occupy a slot on the skill bar. That being said, let's go over a full breakdown of the skill tree and its abilities. Rogue perks feature a wide selection of burst, sustain, as well as control skills. And on the outskirts of the skill hexagon, we have the three main specializations that open up once you hit level 20. So this includes the Duelist, which focuses a lot on the two blades for rapid and devastating damage, incorporating the adrenaline mechanic with a big emphasis on perfect dodges and perfect parries. Then we have the Saboteur. This one uses a lot of traps, auto turrets, and tricks to control the battlefield, offering a more tactical approach to combat. And finally, we have the Veil Ranger, your purely ranged style option of combat that lets you hit multiple targets from afar with your bow, as well as interesting abilities that spread a lot of electric and shock damage. So let's get started with some of the first abilities you get to unlock, including one of your first ultimates. So one of them is going to be the Static Strikes. This is an ability which unleashes twin bolts of electricity that travel in a straight path, shocking enemies on the way, but also priming them for detonation. This is a primer, so you can see the apply over there of a weakened effect, meaning that if anybody in your party, including yourself or your other teammates, have a detonator, you can detonate this for additional damage. This is also going to be a strike and duration ability, meaning that any passive perk that buffs strike or duration abilities will also benefit the static strikes, meaning that you're going to have an easier time going through enemy defenses, destroying shields and armors if you just buff those. The second one is going to be the Concussive Barrage. This is going to be one of your first ultimates. It's basically the fourth skill that you get to use, and it fires a barrage of bombs that deal high amounts of stagger. It's kinda like, but not really, the Leaping Strikes from Inquisition, except that you now throw the explosive rounds with your hands and there's no baked-in dodge. But it's just as effective at completely destroying enemy defenses. As you can see, there's high amounts of damage and it absolutely shatters them right away. So a very good source of physical damage. Now, an ability we absolutely fell in love with in our 7-hour preview was the Lightning Flask, an absolutely devastating AoE ability. It basically lets you smash a flask of lightning that explodes at your feet, unleashing a shockwave of electricity all around you that continues to trigger a few more times every couple of seconds or so. And this one is great at applying the shock debuff on all targets, which is a great way to just reduce their overall resistances to fire, ice, and electricity. So it kind of feeds into itself or any build that makes use of these types of debuffs. But it's also a control and a duration ability, so it benefits from passives that affect such abilities. For example, Shattering Control boosts the damage of this ability against armored enemies. Now, the fourth ability is the Pilfer. This deals damage to the target, steals a potion from it in the process, and then immediately consumes it, as well as applying a guaranteed bleed effect on your enemy. So this can be quite useful since you're limited to the number of potions you have, so essentially it means even more survivability in combat. It's also a combo detonator, so it's a great way to set up synergies. You can even set up a synergy on your own with this, as well as the Static Strikes, or any other party mates that have primers in their kit. It also applies Overwhelm, which is basically a way to stun enemies, particularly useful versus some of the tougher brutes. But the bleed mechanic is what's really good over here, and that's because we have tons of passives that can buff our damage, stagger, or even guaranteed critical hits when we apply bleed on our targets. Like for example, marked target is going to guarantee critical hit with a lightning flask if we just apply bleed to said target. And this brings us to another mechanic I want to talk about from the rogue, which is Affliction. So besides bleed, rogues can also apply necrosis to the target, and there are many passive perks that will let you gain necrotic blade buff from performing different actions, such as for example when performing takedowns you can gain that buff via victory rush, or when damaging weak points via poisonous precision, or when performing perfect parries via poison reply. And once you perform that, you're going to have the buff on the weapon so that you can spread that even more to targets. In fact, there's a lot more ways to convert bleed stacks to necrosis to gain even more benefits, such as via blood poisoning, but you can actually go a couple of steps above that and truly make this into a way to spread Affliction to the entire battlefield. Say you really like using control abilities like the flask we just talked about. Well, Noxious Presence can make it also spawn noxious fumes that further apply that to targets in range. Or if you consume a certain amount of momentum, you can have a necrotic fog to appear, which further spreads that even more. And there are many passives to further increase the damage, the stacks, and even make it easier to destroy your enemy's armor and defenses, which you really want to do, especially against the tougher challenges. And since we're on the subject of necrotic damage, we do have quite a few abilities that do that. So before going into specializations, we saw the Hurricane of Blades, which lets you spin around rapidly, hitting targets up to 4 times with the final strike dealing more damage. We saw Rain of Decay, pretty much Rain of Arrows, but it performs necrotic damage on the target, plus it's an area/control ability, so pretty good for a Veil Ranger. Then we have the Toxic Dash, dash towards the target, dealing damage and applying necrosis. So this is a primer. It is going to set up detonations later on if you also have a detonator like the Pilfer. It also applies the Sundered effect, so pretty good against debuffing defenses. Really great option if you want to play with Affliction Rogue. One ability that's interesting is Explosive Daggers. This unleashes a barrage of sticky explosive daggers into the target, dealing physical damage, but it's also a projectile/duration ability and a combo primer, so you can set up more detonations with it. However, this can fit a very takedown oriented playstyle, and takedowns, they have a lot of perks in the skill trees here that give some big bonuses, especially when it comes to extra momentum, extra HP, and more so extra ultimate damage. So this can feed into a build that really builds up that ultimate damage to truly unleash your maximum potential over there, really get the high numbers if that is what you're aiming for. But let's talk a bit about one of the first specializations, which is the Duelist. So Duelist has a really interesting mechanic right before it that you cannot miss, which is Adrenaline, so we do have to talk about it. It's not exclusive to the Duelist, you can also use it with any of the other options, but it's obviously best for a melee build. And that is because this lets you gain a very strong damage buff that can also interrupt targets if you just strike 10 times without getting damaged. So you just have to hit targets 10 times without getting damaged. It sounds a bit restrictive, but you pretty much take all of these drawbacks away by just investing into these passives right here in the Duelist skill line. So going with the Mounting Thrill lets you stack Adrenaline up to 3 times for even more damage and enemy interrupts. If you get Adrenaline Rush, then you reduce the number of attacks needed to activate the buff by 2. And finally, if you get Deflection, this lets you lose only 1 stack at a time instead of all of them when you get damaged. Plus, you gain a huge 40% damage reduction buff on top. You can even add Energy Burst. Yeah, there's pretty much going to be a way for you to gain even more HP and momentum by just having these Adrenaline stacks on, which is absolutely crazy. This is going to make the Duelist an insane powerhouse, especially if you're going full on melee. This is going to be the one that you really need. But there are some active abilities here that are super strong too. So one of them is the Murder of Crows. Pretty much it's the old 1000 cuts from Inquisition. So this huge circle in which you slash and dash through all the targets for some really big damage, except that now you're dealing necrotic damage, but still very useful. And then we have the 1000 cuts. This is going to cost 2 momentum points, so it's quite expensive. But this slashes 16 times with a very devastating series of blows. You kind of assume this Duelist pose when you perform it, but you are kind of locked in that animation. It is a strike and control ability, so it can be buffed very well with passive perks that buff the damage, criticals, and even bypassing resistances or defenses on targets with those. But it can also be buffed to reduce enemy defenses on its own via the quick control very close to the node. Now let's move on to the Veil Ranger. This is going to be your ranged option, further buffing up your bow damage as well as your bow combos. You gain multi-arrow shots, headshot damage bonuses, slow down time, and more ways to trigger AoE shock bursts against targets to debuff their defenses or resistances even more. So one of the abilities that you get on the way that greatly benefits this is the Hunter's Focus mechanic. So this lets you slow down time when you charge up your bow, but it will spend your momentum when doing so. But this can be very good since you have quite a few triggers for perfect headshots over there. So you can even make your arrows splinter when you perform that. So going over some of the better options here, we have Archer's Rhythm, which you can hold right click to charge and release arrows to their maximum damage potential, pretty much getting a 50% damage potential from it. We have Hamstring, which lets you knock down enemies when hitting them with a charged arrow to the leg, very useful for some extra CC. Sniper's Triumph, charged headshots make the next shot to fire multiple arrows at once. We have Opportunity Shocks, so when above 66% momentum, bows deal extra electric damage, and perfect shots enhance that effect. And then finally we have Storm's Call here. Like I said, max shocked stacks can make enemies trigger electric bursts around them. So this can have a lot of electricity damage and shocks going all around, plus that extra burst of damage means a lot of extra explosions. But let's also talk about some of the abilities in the area. We do have an ultimate, which is the Twin Gifts over Lathan. This lets you throw 2 entangled relic fragments that rapidly bounce between enemies. A very solid, high damage way to take down entire groups. And Storm's Path, which is basically going to fire a massive blast from the bow, damaging all enemies in the way. A very good sort of snipe mechanic. It's also a detonator, so you can detonate any primer that's on the targets. It deals electric damage, it doesn't cost too much, it's only 1 momentum, and you can make it even stronger via compound bow. You can actually make a lot of your bow damage and projectile abilities a lot higher damage with the compound bow perk, because you will add your bow base damage to all of the projectile ability. So that is going to be really huge if you're leaning into that. You really want to go with that and gain that extra bonus. And finally, we have the Saboteur, which uses deployable auto turrets as a more tactical approach to combat. You can even use some of the traps that you can unlock along the way as you go to the Saboteur skill line. So there's a lot of ways to actually play this as a ranged option, again also with the bow, since you have buffs over there or perks that let your arrow to splinter and go into multiple targets at the same time. So let's go over some of the active abilities. We have Fortune's Fury, which pulls out a weapon and fires a rapid stream of projectiles that deal high physical damage. You can then also toss that weapon to deal some extra damage against the target. Plus, if you press the ability button early, you can just end it a bit sooner. Since, of course, you're going to be locked in that animation, it can be useful if enemies charge at you. Then we have Fortune's Turret. This is going to be one of your main staples of this sort of playstyle. You throw down a mechanized turret that targets enemies and deals damage from afar. So pretty much kind of like having a companion, and once all of its ammo is spent, it explodes for some heavy damage that disrupts nearby enemies. Now, unfortunately, this appeared to be the weakest of the playstyles. However, there are some strong perks over there that will buff tool mechanics. So when they expire, they can provide more arrows back, regenerate your arrows faster so that you can shoot a lot faster with your bow, or even more so gain extra momentum so that you can cast abilities more often. Probably something that synergizes better the more levels you are. We also, of course, had Explosive Trap, also an area and a tool mechanic right before reaching that Saboteur skill line. This can be combined with the Explosive Trap to pretty much have a better combo detonator. The damage over here can be pretty good. Now, we also talked about some unique combo skills over here that you only have for the Saboteur, and some of them make that bow really strong. So one of them is a Massy Death. If you defeat enemies with a charged attack from any weapon, this causes an explosion after a short delay, dealing additional damage all around them. So this is both great for the bow, but also for the melee, you can definitely implement a bit of that. However, like I said, there are multiple skills for the bow here. So one of them that helps with AoE is the trick shot. Every 5th arrow that strikes a target splinters into projectiles that hit nearby enemies. And then we have the calling the shot. Every arrow grants precision, and final stack grants 3 arrows. So again, a lot of ways to regenerate that. Maybe this may play a bit better than the Veil Ranger, except that you don't have that much magical or electric damage. You more resort to physical damage, but you may be better at debuffing armor and taking down enemy defenses. Anyway, that is about it with the video. Let me know down below what you think of the rogue class. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.